So hello, everyone. As Tina said, I am Megan Striha. I am a senior epidemiologist with the Public Health Agency of Canada. And right now I work with the Outbreak Management Division. Specifically, we investigate multi-jurisdictional enteric illness outbreaks. So we're a group of almost 30 strong, and we do quite a bit of work on a number of investigations, some of which I will talk to you about today. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what my team does at the Outbreak Management Division, and then I'm going to go through 5 multi-jurisdictional outbreaks that you can see on the screen here. And all of these outbreaks took place between late 2023 and roughly early 2025. So foodborne illness is quite common in Canada. We have about 1 in 8 people each year get sick from contaminated food, or about 4 million people. Most common pathogens associated with these illnesses are norovirus, Listeria, Salmonella, E. coli, and Campylobacter. So you can see some other stats on the screen there and some advice at the bottom on how to keep yourself safe. But in addition to foodborne illness outbreaks, enterics can also stem from contact with pets or other animals. So on the side there, you'll see that 85,000 illnesses are actually related to animal contact each year as well. So when does my team get involved? So we only are involved when there's something called a multi-jurisdictional outbreak. So that means more than one province or territory. So if you can imagine something like a wedding where maybe multiple people get sick from a food source, something like that would be investigated by local public health. If it's something that's happening maybe across a single province, the province might be involved. And my team doesn't become involved at the federal level until there's cases from at least 2 different provinces, or sometimes we have international cases occurring as well. So how do we identify that cases are related? This might be basic for some, but maybe new information for others. But we do something that's called whole genome sequencing. So when you're sick and you seek care from a physician, they'll sometimes collect a sample, usually a stool sample, and that will allow them to confirm what your diagnosis is, what pathogen's making you ill. But then the lab goes a step further and looks at the genome of the particular pathogen. So for example, Salmonella, they'll sequence the entire genome of the Salmonella, and from that genome, we can look and see what other cases in Canada might be closely related. So when the genomes are closely related, we know that people likely got sick from a similar or the same source. So we can connect them that way and know that certain cases are likely to be related. So this is a little bit of a diagram on how our investigations work. So in the middle 4 bubbles there are the main 4 partners that are participating in these outbreak investigations. So of course, there's my team at the Public Health Agency of Canada, and we do deal with a lot of the epi side of things, and we coordinate the investigations. Then, of course, we have the CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. They're responsible for regulatory compliance, for enforcement, and they also do things like recalls. Health Canada develops policies and conducts health risk assessments, so they're included as well. And then the final core partner is both the provincial governments and the local public health. So they're really the kind of front line, if you will, of the investigations. They generally interview cases first when they become ill and collect some information. And a lot of our work is closely partnered with our epi reps in all of the provinces and territories. And then outside of that central bubble, you can see that we also sometimes work with international partners. So the US CDC is a popular one. We work with them very closely, with the European ECDC as well. So we share information about our outbreaks. And if an outbreak is occurring in more than one country, we do coordinate and share information as it's available. And then finally, we sometimes do work with industry as well. So sometimes a certain industry is implicated during an outbreak, and we work with them to share information with them about what's going on in the investigation and also to collect information to help inform what we're doing. And some of that work is done through CFIA or other partners, but in general, we do bring them in as needed as well. Okay, so on to the outbreaks. This is the first one I'm going to talk to you about today. So this was a outbreak that started, we started the investigation around April 2023. So it's a little while ago now, but it was an interesting one. So it was a outbreak of Salmonella, two different types, I4-512I minus and Typhimurium, and it was linked to snakes and feeder rodents, so the mice and rats that are fed to pet snakes. So zoonotic ones are interesting because they're a little bit different, as you can imagine, than foodborne outbreaks. The source is a lot more difficult to manage and control. Like pets like snakes and geckos, we can't like recall them or force people to give them up, and we would never suggest that. So it's we have to take a lot of different approaches than we would if it was a food item that we could recall and control a little bit more easily. So our main course of action when we have zoonotic outbreaks is public education. This is the epi summary I have for this one. So in this outbreak, there were 76 cases of Salmonella across 8 different provinces and territories. You can see the breakdown there. Exactly half were female. We had a very wide age range, which when we get these outbreaks that are a little bit larger, they do tend to eventually span all ages. But you'll see the median is quite young, only 23 and a half years. And that's pretty common for our zoonotic outbreaks. I think I talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. You can see the range of illness onsets and the epi curve that goes with it. In the end, 52 of the 62 cases that we talked to, or 84%, said they did have exposure to a snake or a feeder rodent. So for epi information for this outbreak, it doesn't take very many people, very many cases telling us that they have a pet snake for us to figure out quite quickly that it is a zoonotic and snake-related outbreak. So that's what happened here. Only a handful of people reported having a pet snake, and that was very unusual. So we had a very good idea of the source right off the top. And because of that, we were able to develop a questionnaire that focused on reptiles, rodents, and feeder rodents to gather exposure information from people who are becoming sick and also some behavioral information as well. So we wanted to know, how people handled their pets, hand washing, how they cleaned up after their pet, what they fed them, things like that, to help not only inform how, our understanding of how people got sick, but also it helps us to develop educational products as well, because as I mentioned, that's how we mainly go about trying to control these types of outbreaks. So it functions in two purposes. And the outbreak did disproportionately affect children. So 17% of cases were 5 years of age and younger, and 26 were 10 years of age and younger. And I think, that's kind of maybe intuitive to understand. Kids are not so great at washing their hands and they put things in their mouth. So when you have a pet in the home, snake in the home, it's maybe more likely to end up that cross-contamination happens and they touch their mouths and unfortunately they become ill. And in this one, in addition to interviewing cases, which is pretty much our standard procedure, we also expanded beyond that and interviewed pet stores, suppliers, and breeders where cases had reported they purchased their pets because we wanted to understand a little bit more about the industry itself, different behaviors, different practices, again, that would help us maybe target some intervention. Traceback and sampling. In this particular outbreak, we did do some sampling at cases' homes and from frozen feeder mice as well. So swabs were taken of the snakes, their enclosures, and then from the frozen mice. And the outbreak strain of Salmonella was found in a couple of different places. So that was like a nice laboratory confirmation of what we already knew from the epi, that this was a reptile-related and specifically snake-related outbreak. We also asked cases where they purchased their snakes and feeder rodents. So we were wondering if maybe cases had purchased all of their pet snakes from a single supplier or their feeder rodents and mice from a single supplier, and that might be, lead us to a particular problem where we might be able to do some intervention. But it ended up looking more like one of those walls with like the red string going everywhere. There was a lot of different connections. And despite our best efforts, it didn't seem like there was any single upstream source of these pets or the feeder rodents. So no single commonality. It's just Salmonella just exists in reptiles. And unfortunately, this strain is one that's found in reptiles in Canada. So this slide describes public health action. So I won't go over this every outbreak, but public health alert, just to start us off, is a product that we release on the Canadian Network for Public Health Intelligence, or CINFI. And we release one of these notices every time we start a new outbreak investigation. So the audience of this product is public health officials, public health professionals, and it's just to let them know what's going on. Generally, at this point, we don't have a source. We haven't solved the outbreak, but we just want to let public health professionals know that it's something we're investigating, something we're working on. And we usually have a couple call to actions included in there, whether that be asking some more specific questions when talking to cases that became sick, or submitting lab samples a little faster and things like that. So for this particular investigation, that was released on April 11th. And then, as I mentioned, we were quick to figure out that it was snakes because that's very unusual when people start reporting snakes. So we were able to release the public health notice shortly thereafter on April 13th. So a public health notice is a little bit of a different product. It's one that goes out to the public. It's on the canada.ca webpage. And we usually accompany that with some social media messaging as well to let people in Canada know about the outbreak, know what the source is, and what they can do to protect their health. In this particular investigation, we also had some communications with pet industry partners. So we worked collaboratively with a few different industry partners to ask them to amplify some of our messaging, to, if they had any way to increase education amongst reptile owners, or if they had any ideas of how to help spread our message. So we worked really closely with them, which was great. And we also held a webinar for different pet industry members, including breeders, suppliers, retailers, to share what we had found in our investigation and again, ask for that assistance in spreading the message. So key takeaways here, 44% of cases reported that they did not have direct contact with the snakes. So for example, direct contact would be handling the reptile in your hands. And then indirect contact is everything else. So being in contact with surfaces or objects that the reptile was in contact with, or even just living in the same home. But 44% never handled the animal directly, which is interesting and obviously concerning. We don't want people to get ill. So it is important for us to know that, and helps us with some of our messaging to share with people in Canada that you can become sick from a reptile even if you don't handle it directly. The importance of hand washing there, even if you're just in the area, or et cetera. 52% of cases reported not knowing that there was a risk of salmonella from reptiles, which is again unfortunate because all of these people were reptile owners. So half of them didn't know that this was a risk. And 71% of cases reported not knowing that salmonella could be a possibility from feeder rodents as well. And then I will note that cases have continued in this outbreak because these strains of Salmonella do exist in snakes and feeder rodents in Canada. And we do see a couple of cases, maybe one or two every month, still reported. So we haven't, abandoned the educational approach. We still work on that. We still have different products that go out to the public. We have other ways of communicating with the industry to help share those messages, but it's something we're continuing to work on, and I think a space that we can really improve and work more in to help prevent some of these illnesses and additional outbreaks. So with that, I will move on to the next outbreak I'm going to talk to you about. This one was made quite a bit of news at the time, so maybe it's one that you heard about. This was in late 2023, and it was a couple of different strains of Salmonella, Sohanida, Oranienburg, and Newport, that was linked to cantaloupes. So this one was quite interesting as well because we actually had this solved for us before we even started the investigation, before we even knew people were sick. So the CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, has a program. It's called the National Microbiological Monitoring Program, and they do take samples of various food products and test them for pathogens. So they just happened to collect a sample of cantaloupe, and it came back as salmonella detected. So they knew that there was salmonella in these particular cantaloupes. And because of that, the cantaloupes were immediately recalled. But unfortunately, at that point, some of those melons had already entered the country and people had already consumed them. So illnesses started being reported pretty quickly after. So here's the epi information. There were 190 cases in 9 different PTs, although Quebec unfortunately got the larger portion of the cases in this one. 55%, a little over half were female. Again, we had a huge age range, and then the median was slightly older than our previous outbreak we discussed. And this one is interesting too because you can see the very clear peak in cases around late October, early November, which makes sense for something like melons because it's a fresh produce item. So eventually it will stop being good. You'll either have consumed it or have to throw it away because it doesn't stay good. So we tend to see these kind of epi curves with that strong peak. In the end, we had 105 out of 143 people that we spoke to report that they did, in fact, eat cantaloupe melons before they became sick. We did have a couple of different subclusters, I guess you could say. So there was a good portion of people, about half of people had purchased their cantaloupes at a grocery store, either whole or pre-cut into like a fruit tray or something like that. A third of cases reported cantaloupe from a restaurant, and then the last portion had consumed cantaloupe at a facility like a daycare or a retirement residence. So as I said, we knew the source of this outbreak before we even got started, so we were able to develop a focused questionnaire that really just talked about melons and cantaloupes in particular, and we're able to deploy that to gather really specific information on the source. Here's a bit about subclusters. So 2 daycares, 3 retirement residents, and 4 restaurants had subclusters of illness. And then unfortunately for this outbreak, it was a lot more severe than some of our other Salmonella outbreaks, and it affected vulnerable age groups at higher rates. So 40% of the cases reported to us were hospitalized, and 5% of cases actually passed away, which is really unfortunate, and it's quite a severe one. And it did have kind of correlated with the ages. So again, I mentioned the retirement residents and daycares. They seem to get a lot of this product, unfortunately. So 33% of our cases were 5 years of age and younger, and 45% were 65 and older. So we really had this kind of spread of ages with quite young folks, quite old folks, and not a lot of people in the middle. And of course, those age groups are more vulnerable. So that probably contributed to why this was such a severe outbreak. And then at the same time as we were dealing with this outbreak, the US had the exact same outbreak from the exact same melons. So they ended up with 407 cases across 44 states, and they saw a very similar demographics, so very young and old people getting sick and quite severe as well. So we worked really closely with them on that. But of course, we knew the source, and so they knew the source as well. So they knew it was cantaloupes right off the top as well. Food safety, I mentioned the salmonella was detected in that cantaloupe right off the top. So that brand of cantaloupes was recalled. And then once that was done, there's CFIA does what they call scoping. So they take additional samples of additional brands or maybe, earlier, later shipments. They trace back to where the cantaloupe came from. And through those activities, they did identify some additional brands and types of cantaloupes that needed to be recalled because they were contaminated as well. And in the end, CFA was able to identify that all of the recalled and implicated cantaloupes did come from a single grower in Mexico. So we don't know the root cause of how the cantaloupes were contaminated in Mexico. We just know that, they came from a single place, and we don't exactly know what happened to lead to that contamination. Public health action. So again, we had our public health alert. We shortly thereafter, well, same day actually, had the public health notice that went out to the public to let people know what was going on. And in the end, there were 9 food recalls. So the Malachita and the Rudy brand cantaloupes were recalled. And then there was a couple of secondary recalls for things like fruit trays, fruit salads, things that were made of the contaminated cantaloupe, so it made into a separate new product. Key takeaways for this one, this was the largest salmonella outbreak linked to cantaloupes to have occurred in North America by quite a bit. It was a very big one. Again, we had the investigation start once we already had the source, which saved us quite a bit of time and eliminated the need for us to generate a hypothesis to figure out what was going on, what was making people sick. So it really did prevent illnesses. And in this case, because it was so severe, it probably saved lives as well. So it was really a very clear indicator of how good CFI's program is and how important it is that we have that program looking for contamination in our food products. We also developed some new communications products during this outbreak. So we created targeted messaging to daycares and retirement homes, long-term care facilities, um, to give them some more specific messaging about what to do with these cantaloupes and what to look out for. So we made some nice new partners and new partnerships there as well. Okay, back to zoonotic. This is kind of a 2-for-1. We had two separate gecko outbreaks in 2024. So there was the Salmonella loam outbreak associated with geckos in March 2024, and then the Salmonella munchin outbreak linked to geckos in September 2024. So I'll describe both, but they're very similar, um, even though they weren't related. So one outbreak had 36 cases, the other 25, spread across 7 provinces each. They're both slightly more female than male, had a big age range, but both tended younger, same as our snakes outbreak, although that was more true in the loam outbreak than the munchin outbreak. And in the end, we had 60 to 64% of cases reporting that they did have exposure to a gecko before they became sick. Looking at the curves, these are really nice examples of what our zoonotic outbreaks tend to look like. So because it's not a point source like the cantaloupe coming in all at one time and then expiring, it's just people have these pets in their homes. So we expect to see these kind of sporadic cases spread out over a longer period of time. So these are both quite nice examples of that kind of curve. For epi information, again, it doesn't take very many people telling us that they have a pet gecko for us to start putting the pieces together. So these ones were solved relatively quickly, and then we were able to switch to a reptile-specific questionnaire to gather some of that extra behavior information and so on. Both outbreaks did disproportionately affect children. The Salmonella loam outbreak more so, so 22% of cases 5 and under, and then in the munchin one, 16% of cases were 10 years of age and under. For one of these investigations, we did have a sample taken from a gecko enclosure in a home, and that sample did come back as positive for the outbreak strain of Salmonella. So that was, again, nice laboratory confirmation of what we knew from the epi. And we did, for one of these outbreaks, go ahead and attempt to see if there were any commonalities in where these geckos came from. So we asked people where they purchased their geckos and kind of followed it up the chain. But again, unfortunately, we ended up with just kind of a very intense web of information, and there did not seem to be a single source. So again, we had our public health alert go out and then our public health notice for both to let the public know what was going on. And again, these were nice examples of where we worked really closely with our pet industry partners to amplify some of that public health messaging and share about the outbreaks that were ongoing. So key takeaways, about 50% of cases only had indirect contact with reptiles. So I talked about that in snakes. So 50% of cases didn't even handle the geckos. They just maybe lived nearby or like lived in the same home and maybe touched some things that the geckos had touched, but never handled them directly. And then 67% and 57% were cases reported not knowing that there was a risk of developing salmonella from your pet reptiles. So again, disheartening to see and something we hope we can improve on by amplifying more of our messaging and coming up with different ways to communicate this to reptile owners in Canada. Something else we looked at was the duration of gecko ownership and illness onset. So we thought maybe these were new geckos to the home and that was what was leading people to become ill. But it turns out it was actually quite a variety. So some people had had their geckos for only a couple of days before they became sick. Others had had their pet geckos in their home for over a year before they became sick. So it just really reiterates that geckos and reptiles carry the salmonella in their digestive systems, and they don't usually appear ill. And things like stress and other factors related to their habitat can cause the reptiles to shed more. So after a period of stress, it's even more important to wash your hands and steer clear and take those precautions to avoid getting sick. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. This one also made quite a bit of news at the time, so you may have heard of this one. This is a Listeria monocytogenes outbreak linked to plant-based refrigerated beverages. Also, this was silk milk, for those of you who are familiar with the brand. This investigation started back in July 2024. It was a little bit of a smaller outbreak, so 20 cases across 4 PTs, most of which were Ontario. But I will say for those of you who are less familiar about the different pathogens, Listeria is a lot more serious than Salmonella is. It generally almost all cases are hospitalized, and we do unfortunately see quite a few deaths with these outbreaks. So it's a very serious pathogen and something we take very seriously when we see these outbreaks come up. So there was 20 cases, again, slightly more female. The age range is there and it's skewed slightly older. And you can see from the epi curve that we had a handful of cases back, I think I don't have the year on here, but that must have been back in 2023. So those would have been investigated, but it's very hard when you just have one person telling you what they ate. And if they are sick, it's even harder to kind of get at the exposure information you need to make connections. So those would have been investigated, but it was in June that we saw this uptick of cases. So the investigation kind of ramped up. And in the end, 19 out of 19, so all 19 cases reported that they had one of these plant-based milks. So this one was actually led by Public Health Ontario. So a lot of those early cases were in Ontario, and they had started their investigation and were quite deep into it before it became multi-jurisdictional. So my team and the federal partners did assist in various ways, but this one really was spearheaded by Public Health Ontario. So they get the credit here for the excellent solving of this outbreak. So they, of course, were quick to jump on those cases and try and start figuring out what people consumed that was in common. And one of the strategies was to visit case homes and they take everything from the fridge and test all of it to see if any of it will come back and give them the clue as to what the product might be. So there were, I think there was one leftover a carton of milk that was collected from a case home in June. It was the unsweetened coconut milk, and it did test positive for the outbreak strain of Listeria. So this is a very good clue. But from there, because it was an open carton, if you can imagine people maybe drink out of the carton once they're sick or something like that, it could be that the person contaminated the milk and not the other way around. So once we have that positive result, the next step is to go and get closed samples of the same product to see if those have Listeria as well. So that was the next step. They obtained some closed samples, and those two tested positive for Listeria. So that was very good evidence that this was the source of the outbreak. From there, our CFIA went into the facility that was producing these products. They did sampling of like the environment where the product was made and packaged and things like that. And the outbreak strain of Listeria was also identified in the environment. So it really kind of showed the whole stream of evidence, if you will, from where the product was contaminated all the way to the final product. So again, kind of unsatisfying, but we don't know exactly what happened that led to the contamination at the facility. It's very hard to sometimes complete those investigations. So this was looked into, but no conclusions were drawn about how Listeria came to be in that facility and then made its way into the product. So the public health alert on this one went out in June 27th, and then it did take some time for cases to be interviewed and for the product to be discovered, and the recall went out on July 8th, and then a public health notice on July 17th to let people in Canada know what was happening. So that was 18 different products from Great Value and Silk brand plant-based milks. Key takeaways for this one. This was the first known outbreak of Listeria associated with plant-based refrigerated beverages. So Listeria tends to be, we think of it being in things like hot dogs or deli meats or sometimes cheeses, even some vegetables, it's kind of more likely to be in those. But this was a source that we had never, maybe not considered, but we wouldn't think likely for Listeria. So it was a little bit odd. And it was really great that local public health kept an open mind about the sources and they considered this even though it wasn't a typical source of Listeria. And just kudos to local public health and the provincial public health partners that worked on this one. They were very, very quick and they took it very, very seriously. So that timely collection of data and the sampling really allowed that early identification of the product so we could prevent, more ongoing illness. All right, this is the last one I will talk about today, but this one, it probably is weird to say, but is my favorite of the lot just because it was a bit of a head scratcher for quite a while before we were able to identify the source. So it was a real mystery. This one we started investigating back in December 2024, and I'll give away the answer. The end result was that we discovered that there were a variety of pastries that came from a single manufacturer in Italy. And those different variety of pastries were identified as the source of this outbreak. So this was a Salmonella enteritidis outbreak. This is the epidemiological summary. So we had 79 cases, quite a big outbreak, and it was spread across 5 provinces and territories, although Quebec and Ontario had most of the cases. Again, this one was slightly more female, so about 60% female. We also had quite a wide variety of ages implicated in this one. The median was a little higher at 52. We can see the curve on the far side. So this curve doesn't look like either of the ones I've kind of shown you before. It doesn't have that profile of like a really high spike in a really short period of time that would indicate a fresh produce item, but it's not sporadic like the ones that are zoonotic. So the epi curve can sometimes give us a bit of a hint what's going on in the outbreak as well before we've solved it. In the end, 46 out of 64 people, 72% reported either eating a pastry, eating one of these pastries, or being in a location that we know did serve these pastries. So this is one, as I mentioned, it was real mystery at first. We didn't have those early clues. We didn't have, the sample from CFIA telling us what it was beforehand, and we didn't have people reporting, kind of unusual pets right off the top. So it was one that we didn't have a lot of clues as to what was going on early in the outbreak. So when that happens, it's more of a classic investigation for us. We have a very detailed hypothesis generating case questionnaire. So cases will have been interviewed by local public health. We collect that information, we read what it says, and then we ask to re-interview cases ourselves. So we have a second chance to talk to them with even more detail and ask them more questions. So these can be quite long. They can be an hour or more long interviews. So we really rely on cases to voluntarily give us their time and tell us what they ate leading up to their illness to give us clues as to what might be going on and what might be causing the outbreak. So in this one, yeah, we had to use the full hypothesis generating questionnaire. And early on, we actually suspected garlic. So garlic was quite highly reported. I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 90%, maybe more, in the early days. So that was looking unusual to us. We do have some kind of like reference values. I won't go into too much detail, but we have this program called Food Book, which is a survey of people in Canada, and it asks people in Canada to keep track of what they eat for a week. And then we compile all that information and we kind of can have a estimate of how many people eat a certain item in 1 week. So with garlic, I think we were expecting to see somewhere in the neighborhood of 50, I can't remember, was it 50 or 60%? And so to be seeing 90% of people reporting garlic was unusual. So that's one of the clues that can help us figure out if what we're seeing is expected or if it's high and needs further consideration. So we were considering garlic, and then something else caught our eye. So it was cases that were reporting catered events. So we had a ton of cases reporting having attended weddings, funerals, Christmas parties, conferences, other places where you would expect a catered meal. And it took us a bit of time before this became kind of obvious that there was a pattern, and the more birthday parties and things were happening that one might expect to see in a week. So that was our next kind of clue, and we did go ahead and ask our provincial partners to ask local public health if they could visit these various venues or caterers and get invoices and menus from the various events that people were reporting. So we knew most cases could tell us what date and where they had attended a catered event. So we asked for menus and invoices relating to all of those events. So it was a big ask. and we got a lot of paper and a lot of documents to go through. So those were collected by local investigators. We kind of took them, all the PDFs here, and we started looking through. And eventually we did find an item that was similar across all of these different event invoices. So it was this item that said pastry mini Ital ASST, so assorted. So that was kind of the smoking gun at that point. We knew that, when this particular item was being served to people across all of these different events, that it was highly unusual. It seemed it wasn't a coincidence. We knew at that point. So CFA started their investigation at that point once we'd identified this item was of interest. And what CFIA found was that this item actually was a big box of 12 different types of mini pastries. And there was a total of 120 items in a carton. So it makes sense that this was popular for caterers to purchase and serve at events. There's a variety of pastries and so on. And further traceback identified that one single company in Canada imported this product from Italy. And then it was distributed to Alberta, BC, Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, which are the exact provinces that we were seeing cases in. So everything aligned very, very nicely. And then following that, they did some more, CFIA did their scoping activities. So they looked at other products that were from the same company, and they were able to uncover that there were a couple of additional items that were contaminated as well. Apologies. So public health action for this one, same as the others, we had a public health alert go out. That was December 13th. And then we weren't able to, we worked hard, but we weren't able to solve and find the source until January 18th. That's when the product was recalled. And then 19th was when the public health notice went out to let people know what was going on. At the bottom here, you can see the additional products that were recalled. So the Sweet Cream brand mini patisserie was that carton I was talking about with the 120 pastries in it. And then the DeFay brand lemon delight and tartlet with forest fruits were kind of larger items that were served at like bakery counters and grocery stores. So those ones were able to identify as well that some cases have reported eating those and they were on their purchase records. And then there were some other products that came in from the same company. They were frozen. They were like little croissant type things, and those ones were unfortunately contaminated as well. So some key takeaways here. The source was quite challenging to identify, as I've mentioned a few times. Most cases didn't recall having eaten this item to tell us on their interviews, and it was kind of like a one-off item that you might forget. And it really didn't help us that there was 12 different types of pastries in this box. So one person was describing a cheesecake and another person was describing a tart or a chocolate cake. And we didn't put together that these, were the same item. They were being described so differently by different cases when they did recall them. And then unfortunately, just most people weren't remembering that they, at their Christmas party, they may have eaten a handful of little pastries. So it was a really, really tricky one to identify. But we did learn from it, and we have changed our hypothesis generating questionnaire to ask more specific questions about desserts and about catered events and different events that you might be out at as well. So we're hopeful that if this does come back around again, we'll have an easier time identifying it. And the collection of those invoices from the caterers was really critical for this one. So it was a big ask to get local public health to go out and collect everything that had been served at these various parties and so on, which, it was dozens, if not more items per. So that was quite a bit of work, but it was really, really critical. Without that, it might have taken a little bit while longer just to go off of the epi. So that was great. And then there was some further testing done towards the end of the outbreak to identify which of the pastries in the box were a problem. So there was 12 different pastries, and in the end, 8 of them did test positive for Salmonella, and there was no kind of like pattern. They were all different types. They had all different ingredients. So that in conjunction with these other other products coming from the same company that were positive, it seems like there was some kind of contamination issue in the facility. And again, because it was a facility in Italy, we never did find out exactly what had caused the contamination in the first place. Okay, so to wrap up, just some keys to success for these outbreaks. Quick action, of course, is of utmost importance, especially when it's something serious like Listeria. It's really important to have that quick um, response to let us take public health action quicker. So Listeria outbreak with the silk milk and the cantaloupe investigation were really good examples of where quick action or timely action really helped us prevent further illness. Keeping an open mind to new sources is really also important. So the silk milk was, again, a really good example of that. That wasn't a source that people tended to think of when you thought of Listeria. So that was great that that was considered and we captured it. And then multiple strategies are sometimes needed as well. So we do, have the hypothesis generating questionnaire, but in the case of the mini pastries, we had to go and get those invoices and the menus and so on. So it sometimes takes a variety of strategies before we can sort out what's going on. The outbreaks, they're a great opportunity for us to collect data that informs longer term health protection approaches as well. So I've mentioned this a few times with the reptiles. We really use those interviews to try and sort out what's causing people to get sick, but then to also collect that behavioral information that will lead us to know where to target interventions. And then the final one, which is probably the biggest, honestly, is collaboration. So, there's my team at Public Health, but these outbreaks involve quite a few people. Our calls are upwards of 80 to 100 people that are all working on this across all the different agencies at the federal level, the provincial level. We have local public health too that are working and interviewing all these cases. So it's really a giant collaboration, and we're really grateful for all of our partners, that we wouldn't be able to be successful in all the ways that we are.